Yeah, and we've all been guilty of that because growth is so addictive. You
Mm,
get such high dopamine dumps when it comes to seeing that top line revenue. That's why I say revenue is vanity,
yes.
profit is sanity. And the idea that you're always seeing these big numbers grow at the top, you're seeing more employees come on, you're seeing bigger vendor agreements and you feel like you're doing all these bigger things, but at the end of the day, it's not generating a higher degree of return. Grant Cardone was quoted saying, "Success is my duty, my obligation, and my responsibility." Now, Christian, you've been quoted saying profit is not optional. It's my duty. Talk to me a little bit about that and why you think that's such an important statement.
I love being compared to Grant Cardone. The profit imperative is very easy to define. You have to do it for yourself to cover your financial obligations to you and your family. Beyond that, you have to provide for the people that depend upon you, such as employees, contractors, and third, the people you serve. Like if you're doing something important and valuable to others, you have to have profit to sustain the business to be able to continue to serve them.
And why do you think then, with that as a underlay, and for every business to be able to serve themselves, serve the business and the people that they serve as clients, why do you think so many businesses treat profit like a luxury?
I think it goes back to their personal money mindset, and everybody comes to business from a different place. So, some of them come with a background. They had parents as entrepreneurs and they're very comfortable with that. Some of them come from, literally living in cars and having that scarcity mindset. So, I think you don't change who you are when you start a business or you come to the business. You bring those financial habits and mindsets to the business, and however you handle money personally is how you're going to handle it in the business.
So you think a lot of that comes from the idea that people have walked into the businesses with a mindset that doesn't have that mindset of abundance, a mindset that has a mindset more of a scarcity mindset, and a mindset that doesn't have a winning mindset around.
100%. And I've seen it many, many times where, it can be a belief such as, I didn't work hard, therefore I shouldn't make money, because, you have to work hard to make money, and so that's a common one. People can't get over that. Well, I didn't really put that much effort into it. Why should I get paid for that? Or why should I get paid more for that? Some of it is, you could have a belief that I'm not worth it. Maybe it's a self-esteem thing, or they've been beat down in life and they just don't really believe that they're valuable, and therefore what they do isn't valuable.
And when you look at that, I mean, it goes to the whole idea around, I think a lot of people say, well, you got to work hard, and every day you're going to work hard, and you're going to grow that business now. And eventually, years later, now you can start thinking about profit. How does somebody replace that habit?
Well, so we all work on these beliefs, and the beliefs drive our actions. And most of the time, people don't even understand that these beliefs are forming their actions. And so the first thing is to identify that belief. Like, let's use, you got to work hard to make money. You have to make that connection of, this is what I believe, so this is why I'm acting this way. And if you don't make that connection to that belief and then pull that belief into your conscious mind and really examine it, you can't make any changes in your behavior.
We look at the way that we were brought up, and you think about what we're going to do is we're going to spend, 8 years of our life in getting up to middle school. And then we're going to spend, 4 years in high school. And then we're going to go out and spend scads of cash on university. We're learning 80% of the things that we're learning we're never going to use again.
Yes.
Or you learn about the migration of the gecko and all these things. And I'm sure somebody, that's their focus. But generally speaking, most of the population is not, that is not an ongoing concern. So we spend all this time in high school, in middle school, and then in university with a big price tag. Do you think that pattern of delayed gratification in the way of profit leads to a mindset?
Potentially. I hadn't really thought about that. I mean, I think most of what we're taught in modern day education is not useful for most people and definitely not for entrepreneurs. The education system works around convergent thinking, the recitation of facts. Very few education facilities teach people how to have divergent thinking and how to actually think for themselves, which that's absolutely required in an entrepreneur. And a lot of people have that trouble with that mindset shift of going from I'm an employee and I get paid and I do what I do to being an entrepreneur where everything is your responsibility. If it's not working, if you're not achieving what you want, it's up to you to do something about it.
I think that goes, I mean, one of the things that's a huge important thing for me is helping people really get around the idea of agency.
Mm-hmm.
And agency well, it sounds like a pretty interesting thing that real estate agents and
Sounds like a legal
planners,
term.
yeah, it sounds very legal. But what it is it's really about freedom, because agency means that you're taking control of the things that are around you. And I think a lot of time when people look at the financial element of their business, they don't retain agency because they let other things jump in, whether it's taxes or vendor or market conditions or employee demands. They really don't take agency around profit. And if somebody's going to start to look at that, I think one of the big things is people say, okay, well, maybe once a quarter or once a year, I'm going to go out and I'm going to look at my books and kind of figure that. But I know in Profit First, the original Profit First with Michael, he wrote that profit is not just an event, it's a habit. And so the idea of going to the idea of it can't just be a one-time event. It's got to be a series of events. And that first starts with the idea of taking agency, and then it goes to implementation.
Well, yeah, I mean, Mike's a great example of that. I mean, he had two businesses that, he sold for money, but didn't really make money along the way. And then after he pissed off everything that he had made on his last sale of his business and was bankrupt, he started to say, well, there's got to be a different way. That's the agency component, right? Like, I did it the way I thought or I was taught or whatever. And that didn't work. So now what? And you definitely can approach that with the attitude of a victim, where, you don't have any control of the variables. And look, you don't have control over most of the variables, virtually all of them, right? And so that's a perfectly rational way to look at that and say, well, I failed because of X, Y, and Z. But all of that being true, what can you affect? What can you do to change it? Because you're the only one that you can fully control.
Yeah, I think the idea that the victim mentality is that the world around me is a series of events that I can't control. And I do agree that there's a lot of events that you cannot control, but you can definitely control your response to those events. If there's a market shift, what are you doing to address it? If there's one of your key employees is decided to leave, what are you doing to solve that? What could have you done in advance in building out a bench to solve that? So some of these things that you could do to really build that out so that you have a habit of success, I think it's really important. Now, I want to talk a little bit about your first, because a lot of times we talk a little bit about school. And what was your first instance of money memory? If you look back and you think as a child is going through, with your dad looking at some things, talk to me about what that looks like, your first instance of money mindset.
Yeah. So I actually think I asked you this question originally when we talked before. So you stole it, and that's fine because it's a great question. I stole it from one of my employees. So we're all, that's what we call R&D. That stands for rip off and deploy. So
100%.
Yeah. My first money memory is not really a specific instance, but more of, it was just ubiquitous and everything about money. My family had a family business and they were successful and we never talked about money. Money was just there. And so I came into the business with, not a scarcity mindset, but this mindset that, you can always make more money, literally.
And how did that work out?
It worked out poorly because, well, no, it's funny because, you say, well, if you have a scarcity mindset, that limits you. Yes, it does. But having this abundance mindset also causes problems. And that's kind of my point is with beliefs, because, beliefs are just beliefs. They may apply in certain situations. They may not. But the question is, does that belief still serve you? Is it giving you what you want? And in my case, it was, well, because we could always make more money, I did not make enough profit. I did not mind the expenses as I should have, and I spent money foolishly. So, yeah.
So the mindset of abundance, while it was something that allowed you to really focus on growth of that top line revenue, what it didn't do is give you that advantage of benefiting from that top line growth on the bottom line of profit.
Yeah, and it was easily excused as I'm investing in the business. But what it looked like was spending money that was not effective on marketing and over hiring, because we're going to have growth. So, we got to have growth. So we got to have the people in place. And so those two things just sucked the profit. I mean, it wasn't that we weren't making money, but we weren't making nearly as much as we should have.
Yeah, that's one of those things. I think I'm just investing in the business, or
It's a
I
good
get
excuse.
I get a tax write off for this. So I'm just going to write it off. We hear those words all the time, and then you can sort of see that gaunt look in the face of the business owner 2 to 3 years later, because they feel like they're working so hard, but they don't see the fruits of their labor.
Yeah. And that's a real problem. And I've been in a room full of entrepreneurs where Vern Harnish, author of Scaling Up and Rockefeller Habits, the growth guy, as he touts himself, asked this room of entrepreneurs, how many of you could shrink by half and make more money and work less? And virtually everybody's hands went up. And that was a real eye opener to me, because I'm like, okay, I'm in the same boat as everybody else. You're just focused on this grow, grow, grow. And you just end up in a situation where you're working more and making less than you could.
Yeah. And we've all been guilty of that, because growth is so addictive. You get such high dopamine dumps when it comes to seeing that top line revenue. That's why I say revenue is vanity,
Yes.
Profit is sanity. And the idea that you're always seeing these big numbers grow at the top. You're seeing more employees come on. You're seeing bigger vendor agreements, and you feel like you're doing all these bigger things. But at the end of the day, it's not generating a higher degree of return.
No, and you get around a group of entrepreneurs and you start talking about business, everybody's talking about those things. We hit 10 million. We've got 100 employees now. No one sits around and says, how much did you make? How much profit did you make? No one asks that question.
Yeah. And it's I'm heavily in the real estate space, and real estate agents are notorious for this, because what they'll do is they'll go even one step further. They're going to talk about transactional volume. Right. So like, I sold 20 million of real estate. Well, so what? What did you make? Well, did you charge 1% commission, or did you charge 3% commission? Did you pay for $80,000 worth of advertising budget on the back of a bus? And did any of that actually convert, or was that just vanity? And I think, each industry has their own challenges, and your book is specifically Profit First for creatives. And what do you think is the most damaging belief that exists with creatives in the mindset around profit first?
I think they're most damaging. There's two. I mean, we've already talked to one about the not being worth it. Because creatives are divergent thinkers, they have been consistently told, no, get back in the box. You're not giving us the right answer. They don't value what they do. So that's the first one. The second one is that a lot of them just dismiss that they can understand their finances. It's like, I'm not that type of thinker. I'm not a linear thinker. I can't understand finances. And that's a self-limiting belief. It may be more of a challenge. It may be a different challenge for you than someone that's not uber creative, but it's still learnable.
And again, I keep on thinking back, and it should be almost like Profit First for kids.
Yes.
Is a thought process, because, I look at Robert Kiyosaki. We were not taught financial literacy in school. Melody Hobson wrote, most parents would rather talk about a condom than a credit card.
Yes. I don't know about that, but yeah, my kids were scarred because I made them play, other kids got to play different games. I made them play games like Monopoly and Cash Flow for Kids, which was Robert's game board that he came up
I
with.
love that. Did you know that they have the app that's on the phone now? So
No.
it makes all the calculations so much quicker. So the
Okay.
game can actually move at a good solid pace so you don't lose the attention of that 10-year-old.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's brilliant and spot on in that, it needs to be changed at the primary school level, but you can learn it as an adult. And there are a lot of people like Dave Ramsey and Susie Orman and all these people that are out there as financial gurus that are trying to fill that gap. But, I feel like the problem with that is that it's very dogmatic and formulaic, and you can do Dave Ramsey's program and achieve financial success, but you don't necessarily really learn anything about money.
Because you're focusing on the mechanics, not the principle.
Right. Right. And that's fine for most people. But, like if you're going to run a business, you need to understand it more deeply than, it's spending less than you make.
Yeah, and one thing you talk about is just a very simple, easy to use. So guys, if you're a business owner, this is one tools kit that you could use right now, very simply. And if you can't implement this tool, you have to look at your business in a very meaningful way. Because what you suggest is the simplest thing that somebody can do is just take 1% of their revenue and forget about it. Put an account and forget about it. Is that really something feasible?
100%. You're not going to miss 1%. You're not. And you're going to be surprised at, I suggest don't look at it for 90 days. Give yourself 3 months and then look and see what's in there, and you're going to be surprised. And what that does is it just kind of gives you the idea of the potential, that it does work, that you can set aside some small amount and you want it to be a larger amount, but that you can set an amount aside and it be profit.
And when somebody looks at that and says, I can't do that right now. I'm a little bit behind with some of my vendors. I've got a tax account that's last year that was bigger than I thought it needs to be. I need to pay that thing off first. What kind of conversation would you have with somebody like that?
Well, I think I'd still do it because it addresses the mindset, right? You can always look at your financial situation and say it needs to be improved. And you may be in a worse situation than I am, but that doesn't change your mindset. Because if you don't change your mindset, you're not going to believe that you can actually change it. And that's the worst thing, is to be in this financial situation that you don't like. You may not survive it as a business and feel helpless, going back to your agency state.
Yeah, I think in that situation, you're absolutely right. What they're doing is they're allowing those vendors and that sort of thing to control their business and how they manage their business, and thus lose agency. And what you're saying is, no,
Yes.
maintain that agency, create that 1%
Yes.
mentality that this is going to go away. I'm not even going to think about it.
Yeah. And then after 90 days, you can say, okay, what am I going to do with this? All right. Am I going to pay those back taxes? And that shifts your mind into the right space of being proactive about it. So the ideal through Profit First is to develop a working capital account where that you have, depending upon your business, 2 to 5 months worth of working capital in your bank account. And at that point, you experience freedom as a business owner that you never knew was possible. And you really can start looking at your business proactively, because you're not reactive. It's not like, oh shit, I got to make payroll this week. It's okay. What are those things 3, 6, 12 months down the road that I need to be thinking about?
Yeah. There was a guy that I knew a long time ago. His name was Paul Weigel, and he ran an insulation business. And this guy he was a funny duck, but he was a pretty smart cookie. And one of the things that he said is, he said, most business owners get stuck on focusing on urgent tasks, not important ones.
Yes.
And the idea that urgency does not necessarily mean it's important. It just means it needs to get done. Where important means it's going to have long lasting impacts on your business.
Yes. And that is, you're always going to have something urgent, right? The shift though becomes that you can start putting more of your energy and time into the important rather than the urgent.
Now, when somebody's looking at building up the strategy around financial literacy in their business so they can understand, the first thing they do is they look at their technology, QuickBooks or whatever else they're using. QuickBooks did a study saying that financial literacy right now is so important. Why do you think people who know they need this, they know they have this, why is this a thing? Why is this something that shouldn't just be a standard?
Well, I mean, it comes down to, I think at the base level is fear. And it's fear of failure, fear of being a fraud, that imposter syndrome is real. And, it locks us up. And, if you don't have the internal fortitude to, like I said, pull those beliefs out and say, okay, why am I acting this way? I'm acting this way because I believe this. Are you willing to set it down? Are you willing to replace it with something else that serves you better? That's hard work. And so the easy thing to do is to give in to that fear and stay where you are, even though you're miserable.
Now, when somebody's looking at that and they're saying, okay, well, I need to now focus on it. I think you use the word clarity quite a bit. And you talk about profit first is not about cutting. It's about clarity. So with that as an underlay, why do you think so many people think it's still just a glorified budgeting system?
Well, I think, Profit First is a tool. And that's why I start with mindset in the book, because you have to change the mindset before you can effectively use the tool. Going back to like Dave Ramsey and Susie Orman, they just have a tool and they say, use this tool. Okay. But it doesn't do anything about the mindset. And if you don't change the mindset, you can't use the tool effectively. But I think, once you use that tool, you're going to get clarity in your finances and you can reduce expenses, maybe should reduce your expenses. But at the end of the day, that's only going to take you so far. The biggest lever in your business is your gross margin. And that the driver of that is pricing. So I think there's two things that every business owner should be focusing on. And that is their gross margin, a la pricing. Can I extract more value out of our customer? Can I deliver more value to my customer? And second is your direct labor efficiency. So how much gross margin are you receiving per employee? Because those two drivers right there will drive profitability magnitudes beyond anything else.
100%. And I see this, I'm looking at a food business that, really ensuring that the pricing value makes sense, because when they're recruiting on scale for sales reps, you want to make sure that you're amplifying success, not digging yourself a grave. I think, pricing is, I think Warren Buffett's when he said price is what you pay, value is what you get.
Yes.
And I think you were also quoted saying we don't get paid for bookkeeping, we get paid for delivering value.
Yes.
And so I want to, really address this is, what do you think the number one thing that entrepreneurs get wrong when they look at pricing?
They think about it in terms of the business. They think about it in terms of their experience. They think about it in terms of what their competitors are doing, rather than having a deep, clear understanding of the problem that they're solving for who they're serving and what the value of your solution is. But that requires you to shift to think in terms of your customer. And, ideally it means you're having conversations with them. I came to the realization after being in this space for 27 years that people don't buy what we do. They don't buy any of the services we offer. What they buy is a feeling. And the feeling is one of financial clarity, financial peace. They're transforming their lives from being fearful, worried, to clear and safe. And that's what we're selling. That's what they're buying.
Yeah. And I think that's, Patrick Campbell really talked about the idea that pricing is an exchange rate for your business value. And I think that is really important, is to focus on that value. I think most people, to your point, when they're making a decision, everybody thinks they always make a decision that is very logic driven, when in fact, really what happens is we're making emotional decisions that are backed by logic. So we find the logic that matches the emotional decision and we run with it.
Yeah. And most business owners will suppress their pricing and rationalize it. I can't charge that much. I can't charge more, whatever, but that's in your head. That's not reality. The only person that can determine your value is the person that buys it. You can't. And that was a revelation to me. Like I can't force anybody to pay something, right? They're going to pay what they think it's worth. The question is, do you know what it's worth?
Yeah. And again, I think that for me, one of my favorite things to do is to work on people on their offers. And I think the offer is so important because if you have the right offer, it's an unstoppable offer and people will just always want to say yes. In fact, they'll say yes. And how do I get more? Because there's so much value. I said to this one lady, I said, okay, well, if somebody doesn't have any money, could you still sell them something? And the answer is, of course, if it has the right amount of value. And she said, well, I don't know about that. I said, okay, well, let me give you a sample here. If you get a Maserati, if you get a house in Florida on the water, you get a meeting with Warren Buffett for 3 hours, you get to sit with the president of your choice, and you get 10 weeks holidays in your favorite vacation spot, and it's going to cost $10,000. Would you do it? Well, of course. Well, then it's just a value stack. So you just need enough value. They'll go beg, borrow, and steal to get that money to make that happen.
Yes. Yes.
And so it's just a value stack. So if the value stack is so great that what you're receiving is so much more than what you're paying, somebody's always going to say yes. So the inverse side, I guess, for you as a business is going to make sure that value for what you're giving gives the value to business for what you're getting.
Yeah, you'll figure that out real quick. If you're not delivering the value for what you're charging, no one's going to buy it, right? I mean, very simple.
Now, one of the things I want to get a little bit of mechanics because I think mechanics are really important. So guys, if you want to we're getting it into actual things that people could dive into when you're looking at your books to really hone in. Do you have some bad habits that really need to be fixed? And I know one that you talk a lot about is bank balance accounting. Mm-hmm. And how that is a behavioral pattern for people who don't truly understand how a profit and loss statement works.
Correct.
Let's really define what that means and what the pitfalls of it are.
I was talking to a creative last week, and he said when he first heard the term P&L, he didn't know if it was P-N-L or P&L. And so he had to go look it up, right? So yeah, bank balance accounting is what Profit First is driven on. And it meets entrepreneurs where they are because most entrepreneurs look at their bank accounts at least once a day. And so it meets you where you are to use the tools that you're comfortable using. What it means though is that rather than having one bank account, we're going to have multiple bank accounts, and we're going to intentionally separate that money. First is profit. And that's where that 1%, to try the process. But the first thing is to set aside your profit, and essentially everything else is left to spend. And that's the key. But what I found, and I've experienced this in my own business since we've used Profit First, is that when money goes out of that profit account, you've got to transfer money back because you don't have enough to spend money. It is a red flag. It is a warning. It's not failure. What it's telling you is that it's not working the way you thought it was working. And that gives you a point to go back and start investigating. Well, why?
So in this model, what you're saying is somebody who's used to a bank balance style accounting is you can kind of really double down on that, because you can say, look, this is what you're used to. We're just going to walk to where you go. So when it leaves this bank account, it's now off this component of the P&L. It's onto the next component. So this is where our gross revenue comes in, and this is our deposit account. Our deposit gets shipped to our operating account, gets shipped to our expense account, and gets shipped to our profit account. Does that sound right?
That is exactly right.
And when it goes to that operating account, then in that operating account, that's the money you got, and that's the money you got to use. And if you got to start pulling from other accounts to start feeding that account, then you've got to red flag that and say what's going on.
Exactly. Whereas if you're in one bank account, you never have that circuit breaker. You're just spending what's in there.
So if we look at and I'm going to pull it out of the creative for a moment, because I know that's where you're focusing, to something maybe I might understand as well, which is maybe a real estate agent or a construction business. When that money comes in, as even as a construction business, it's a draw on a large contract, and proportionally there's certain expenses that are going to be higher at certain points. How does somebody reconcile operational variability based on, splitting it out into those different accounts?
I'm going to answer the question, but I'm not sure that I completely understand it. And then maybe if I don't answer it correctly, you can push me back. Construction is one of those industries that is notorious for lots of dollars, right, and low margins. And Mike talks about in his book, like a construction company that's doing $5 million in revenue, but 4 million of it is going right back out to subs and materials and everything else. So really you don't have a $5 million business, you have a $1 million business, because none of that money was ever yours, and managing it as $1 million company rather than a $5 million company. But, I think operationally, if you have a plan, like you think that you can make 10% profit, if you set that aside up front and you go about the day and weeks running your business and you have to dip into that 10%, something's wrong.
First of all, I think you really explained something that's so critical for people to understand, is what truly is the size of your business. This is something that we do in our mortgage business.
Yes.
We have a bunch of agents, and we separate the revenue that comes in from them that just washes back out to them as a completely separate account than the stuff that's our operating account. It's almost like in the real estate world, they would call it a trust account that you would put into that space. And that's not my money. That just comes in and goes out. And then where it comes into the leftover that comes to the brokerage, whether it's a split or a monthly payment, that's actually the true reflection of the size of our business.
Yeah. And that's what you should base your percentages in profit first off of, not the top five, not the 5 million, because that's not a real number to you. As a matter of fact, Mike calls it real revenue. Like, so, the $1 million that's left over after paying the subs and everybody else, that's your real revenue. I call that gross margin, but it doesn't matter what term you're dealing with, but that net is really what is the profit driver of your business.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of people, that's going to be a hard thing to reconcile because they're so used to about talking about their big business. Mm-hmm. Whereas they actually have a small business inside a big operating concern.
Yeah. And we've gotten to the point now where in our company where we don't care about the top line. I mean, we account for it, we measure it, but the most important number is the gross margin. Is the gross margin number going up? Because that's the only thing that matters.
So when you're looking at your gross margin, and guys, just to really get the detail on the gross margin, if we look at revenue, so you have $1 million coming in, then you're looking at your cost of goods sold. And then after that, that's what's getting to your gross margin. And then you have your expenses, and then you have gross profit. Is that a good depiction?
That is a good description. So for a non-accountant, I give you an A+.
Well, thank you. And when we look at the cost of goods sold, let's play that out for a little bit, because this is something I've argued with accountants many times. As to what should exist in the cost of goods sold and what should not exist in the cost of goods sold.
Good question.
My belief, and correct me if I'm wrong on this one, my belief was that if I have somebody who's doing work where their work is directly tied to something that has something is sold and they need to perform against that contract or whatever else it is, that is cost of goods sold. And so if somebody is, say, 50% of the time out on jobs, if we talk about construction, that's cost of goods sold. If it's 50% of the time in the office organizing paperwork or, loading and unloading the truck, that is fixed expenses.
Yes, I would agree with you conceptually. I would say as a practical matter, splitting salaries is difficult because do you actually have time studies? Do you know what the value to the organization of that employee really is? I mean, in other words, is it more important that they manage the job, or is it more important that they do the administrative piece? And setting a value to that. So it gets complicated very quickly. I suggest that you pick one lane and go with it just as a practical matter, and then just be consistent with it. And then it doesn't really matter what, because you're using the same base.
Yeah, I think the idea of simplification, if you get too complicated, I mean, we were fortunate because the way we tracked their hours, it just in the back end applied everything, and it allowed me to be able to identify where cost overruns were and the time
Yeah,
that
and
people
I
spent.
don't think there's anything wrong with that. Again, I think the consistency is the important part. Are you keeping that consistent in how you're tracking it?
Well, it goes right back down to the very beginning, roping it right to this is habits. What are your habits?
Uh-huh.
And habits are consistency. Gary Keller, I was down with him in Austin just a few months ago, and he said the most lovely thing. He says the intensity comes through consistency. And we can think about that when we look at anybody who's highly successful. It's not because they did something once. It's because they're able to do the same thing again and again and again. And that repeatable success is why they've created the lifestyle that they have and the legacy that they've built.
You do MMA, right? Yeah. I love Bruce Lee's quote of fear not the man that can do 100 kicks, but the person that has practiced one kick, 1,000 times. That's a paraphrase. I don't know what exactly he said, but it is the idea that, that person that's got one good thing is much more valuable, dangerous, whatever context, than the person that knows a little about a whole bunch.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. There was a jiu-jitsu master. His name is Hodger Gracie. And Hodger Gracie would go to these tournaments and he would do a double leg. He would then pass guard. He would then get to mount and then he would cross choke every time.
Simple.
Very basic, very simple. Everybody knew when he's going to the tournament, that's exactly what he's going to do. And he would beat everybody with it because he was the master of that one simple concept.
Can't stop it.
Taking something that is very simple and becoming a master of simplicity makes it way more effective than being an average person at doing something very complex.
Yes. And there's another Bruce Lee idea. He called it the daily takeaway. Bruce Lee invented Jeet Kune Do, which was a new fighting style, but he was trained classically in Kung Fu and then learned boxing and fencing when he came to America. But his whole thing was what can I take away each day to make it more simple? Because he viewed Kung Fu as they had made it overly complex over the centuries on purpose. Like, I think that's the thing about anything over time is it just grows barnacles and it gets more complicated.
Yep. Yeah. Actually it was, I own a mortgage business and, one of the vendors in our industry were talking about all the new legislation that's come out and he called it legislation inflation. Is that anything that, just exists over a period of time is going to, get to certain points of complexity based on inputs and then, realized, eventually that there's a utility that it's lost in its complexity.
The IRS code is a great example.
Well, it keeps accountants and lawyers, tax accountants,
that's right,
tax lawyers employed.
Yeah. And most of those tax laws are actually called lawyer and accountant employment acts.
There you go. Now, if somebody wants to build their first value-based pricing model today, where should they start and what do they need to unlearn first?
I think it depends on where they are in the stage of business, because when you're starting a business, it's easier to see than if you have an existing business. So I'll talk about the existing business because that's a harder lift. I think what you have to do is forget everything you think you know. When we revisited our service offerings and pricing last year, we spent about 6 months retooling, rebranding. But where we started was we went back to client interviews and we listened. What were they buying? Why were they buying? Why did they choose us? And you have to put yourself in the seat of the customer. You have to take that seat. And fortunately, we had all those interviews recorded so we could go back and do them. But if you don't, just pick up the phone, get on a Zoom call, find out. Like, I think that's a great question. Why did you pick us? Why did you do business with us instead of somebody else?
I think that's so critically important that most people lose is that communication with their customer. They get the sale and they never ask why, because they're just so darn excited that they actually got the sale and that they just move on into implementation and they lose that moment of that critical piece of data that they could grab about what the connection to the decision point, because we all know that there's people who are interested in your product, but the turning interest into action is such an important element to understand as to why somebody does that. And if you could, at that moment, understand their psyche as to why they did it, you're really going to truly dive into the value that you bring.
Yeah. And I think you could spend a lot of time doing that and never really, I feel like if we can get to 80, 90% of solving the customer's problem and an understanding of why they bought from us, I think you're doing good. I don't think you ever get to 100% because, humans don't act rationally, for one thing. And two, they're not necessarily good at explaining their emotions. Like, to your point, they can tell you the rationalization of why they bought you, but they don't necessarily understand the emotion that actually drove that decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when people are looking into their customer journey, I think number one, that is a huge one. But the other thing too is there's other key indicators that you talk about that people don't really spend time on. And these are things like CAC or LTV. And these little acronyms are really important. I want you to explain what those acronyms mean and what's the dangers of people pricing blindly without thinking of those in mind.
Yeah. So I think from a marketing standpoint, business owners don't really have an expectation of success with money that's spent on marketing. Whether you're hiring an agency, you're doing it yourself, it doesn't matter. But some of those things that I think are critical to look at are the two you mentioned. One, lifetime value of customer, that's LTV. So how much is that customer, the new customer that you acquire, how much are they going to spend over their lifetime with you? Okay. And, you probably don't know what that number is. You may have to do some work and research to figure that out. But then the second is the cost of acquisition, or CAC, is how much did it cost you all in to bring that person on board, and understanding that relationship between those two. So in our business, our clients tend to stay with us for a very long time. So they have a very high lifetime value. But our cost of acquisition is also very high. And so, you can say, well, it makes sense to spend that money because it's worth so much. If I just throwing numbers out there, if I have to spend $10,000 to get a client that's worth $100,000 to me, yeah, that makes sense. That's a no-brainer. However, that $10,000 may represent their entire first year revenue with me. And so I've got to outlay the cash before I get paid back, right? So it's understanding the dynamic between those two really gives you insight then to go and how you spend your money.
One thing that I think a lot of SaaS businesses don't really take into consideration is the lifetime value. They arbitrarily assume that client's going to be with them forever when, we know that the commitment rate on, certain products and services might not be that case. It might be 6 months. It might be 3 months. And if you're pricing for somebody to be there with you for the next 3 to 5 years, just assuming your churn rate is going to be at, an all-time low, it sets up for very unrealistic expectations.
Yes. And technology is going to change, and you don't have the actual history. You assume 3 years. I have the benefit of actual history, so I know how long they stay with us. But if you're making assumptions because it's a new product, new service of how long someone's going to be with you, you better be pretty conservative.
Now, I want to pivot into somebody's now got their really understanding of their lifetime value of their customer. They understand the cost of acquisition. So they've got a nice little model built out. They have the money coming in and they want to, keep into that system of success. And I firmly believe that people have motivation to kind of get them going on things. It's kind of like the kerosene on an already burning fire. They've got discipline, which is that those embers that keep on burning. And then they have that willpower, that kind of keeps them going, which is those wins. So that would be your marshmallows or your s'mores that get cooked or your hot dogs or whatever. There's moments that kind of keep you sitting in front of that fire so that things are going. You said that your mindset went from scarcity to vault building. And I want to talk about vault building. And what did it feel like the first time you opened a profit account and saw real money actually sitting in there untouched?
Well, the first time we did it was back when my brother was my partner and I had a third partner, and the business was an absolute mess. And we did it, and we got to the end of the year and we had some expense that we thought we wanted to spend it on, but we were trying to decide. And my brother said, well, we have this money that's in the profit account. And I'm like, oh, I completely forgot about that. Right. And because it wasn't on online bank access, I didn't see it. It just wasn't top of mind. And that's exactly what the mindset you want. Now, I didn't take the right action. We spent the money when I don't think we should have. I mean, that was profit set aside for a purpose. And that's how you get into that loop of, well, I'm just investing it in the business. Well, that's bullshit most of the time. It's a rationalization.
Well, that's where I think you were saying, like, profit isn't what's left, it's what's planned.
Exactly. It's what you set aside up front.
And so did you reinvest that money?
I spent it on something. I don't even really remember what it was. But, the point was we never got profit first right because when we first implemented it, because frankly, the business was not profitable enough to support 3 partners. At the end of the day, that was the fundamental problem with it. Implementation of profit first was a nightmare because we had like 6 different entities. And now that becomes like 30, 40 accounts, bank accounts. And because we weren't making the money that we needed to support the 3 partners, we were constantly moving money around. And so like it defeated the whole purpose. So yeah, I go into this in the book. I mean, like I have screwed up profit first. I have done all the things wrong with it so that you could do with it. So learn from my mistakes.
I mean, the idea of standing on the shoulders of giants is so that you can look above what normally would be in your way vis-a-vis the work that they have done. And usually it's the work that they've done wrong.
Yes.
And really what those giants are trying to do is to elevate you to that point that you don't have to go through what they've gone through. And so it is so much easier for people to learn from other people's mistakes, but it's hard for people to actually do that. Why do you think that is?
I can speak for me and my experiences, but I think it applies to others. As an entrepreneur, you have to have a certain bent to you and a certain set of personality traits. You have to be able to hold the vision of what you see as possible at the same time as ignoring what actually is going on. And I think that characteristic that helped me start the business, what I call it could be persistence, it could be stubbornness, depending upon what the context is. I mean, that's just right. But that was a characteristic of me, maybe a belief. But at the end of the day, I had to make a decision. Is this serving me anymore? And can I set that aside? And fortunately I could. But it took a lot of beating my head against the wall and having my teeth kicked in before I was like, okay, it goes right back to your agency statement. I have to do something different. Like if I don't like the situation I'm in, I have to do it differently.
Now, does this tie a little bit into the Christmas vault moment that we talked about before?
Well, vault is so setting aside a certain amount in profit on a quarterly basis. Profit First recommends that you take half of that out as your profit distribution, your return on your business investment. You don't spend it on anything in the business. You go take your family on your vacation. You take your wife out to dinner. It depends on the dollar amount. It doesn't really matter, but you're not spending it in the business. You're spending it on yourself and your family. But the other half sits in there and builds up. And what will happen is over the period of, 18 to 24 months, depending upon your business, you're going to end up with this excess profit that's sitting in there. And that gets transferred ideally to this vault account, which it's break glass in case of emergencies, right? Like it's not to be used to run your business. It is the cornerstone of being able to work on your business proactively.
And what do you think that would do for most business owners today where they're looking at these tariffs, they're looking at shifts in inflation and all these things that are creating market volatility? What do you think it would do for the stress levels around the business owner by having a vault?
Well, it's the same thing that happened in the pandemic, right? So those people that had that vault, which we weren't one of them, Okay. Admittedly, you become more reactive and you're like, oh God, I've got to get these PPP loans and the ERCs to help my business stay afloat. What those people that had the money in the bank already did was they took that and they were able to leverage it because they didn't need it. Right. And I'd say the same thing in any disruptive situation. Like if you're in tariff, well, okay, every one of your competitors is thinking the same thing, but virtually none of them have money in the bank. And so you can take advantage of the way they're reacting. You can leverage what you have, right? It just is a complete game changer.
And I look at Gary Keller again, and Keller Williams, and that mindset is what helped him through the whole NAR, National Association of Realtor situation. Is they had a massive vault, and they build into their franchises that mindset that you need to have contingency money in an account that is in a glass box that you're shattering the glass to get that money. It's not in the slush account. It's not in the easy to access. It's, password protected, and it's going to take effort to inject that into the business. So now you're in urgency mode.
Yeah.
And had the bigger that account, that when you dive into it, and if you don't even notice that it's coming out, then you're sitting pretty at that point.
Well, and it also gives you the freedom that once that money is in there, that, you come to your next quarterly and you take all that money. You don't have to even think about it. Like, I don't need this money in the business. It's mine. I can take it and do what I want with it. But it relieves that pressure of, should I leave this in the business? Should I not? No, you don't need to. It's already there.
That's where I think a lot of people need to really hone in around the idea of stress management. And because just like a fighter going into a fight, they're not going to produce at their highest level of training. They're not going to do those, unless their stress level has been brought down because they're so comfortable operating in the space. They're going to operate their lowest degree of training, not their highest. And just like a business owner, if your stress is at the highest amount, you're not going to be operating at your highest efficiency.
Yes.
It's the inverse response. You're going to be operating at your lowest.
Yes. And I think, unfortunately, I did for a very long time. And I know a lot of other business owners are the same. They just accept that as a part of doing business. Like, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm therefore going to be stressed. And I'm telling you, it doesn't have to be that way.
No. And I think the less that you take on that stress, the more effective you're going to be in operating.
100%. 100%.
I think there's some people that are addicted to the stress mechanism, and that addiction to the stress mechanism propagates more stress. How does somebody like that move to a stress-free mindset?
Well, being stressed out all the time, it takes its toll on you, mentally, physically, and I don't think it's sustainable. Like, at some point you're going to break. Some people call it burnout, whatever. It doesn't matter. You're going to reach a point where your body says, no, we're not doing this anymore. And so it's really more of, are you going to wait for that to happen? Or are you going to be proactive about it and do something beforehand? Because it's not sustainable.
Yeah. Grant Cardone was quoted once in saying, always be broke. And his whole idea is you make that money, whatever's, you budgeted for, you're going to take that, you're going to drop that into an account. It's not going to be seen again. And you're back down to ground zero again. And now you're building. So you've taken that money, parked it away in that untouchable. What do you think of that concept?
I think it's similar. So I read a book recently by a advisor to wealth management advisors. So he's an advisor to advisors. And he actually wrote a book to have his advisors give their clients. And
was it Ed Millett or?
I don't remember the name of it. I've got a copy of it sitting up at the front desk. I can get it for you. What I found fascinating about it though was his whole principle was get 2 years cash. This is you personal in your finances. You get 2 years cash so that you know that if you don't have any money coming in, you've got 2 years to live, right? Cover your basic expenses and then invest everything else and invest it, prudently, but aggressively. Like in his situation, talking to individual investors is put it all in stocks because that's going to give you your highest rate of return over time. And you have this cushion that you can write out. You don't need to take it, right? But I think it's a very similar thing that you need to be, once you've accumulated profit, you need to decide what you're going to do with it. And I think the first benchmark for any business owner is cover your personal expenses, cover your lifestyle. That's the first benchmark. Eventually you get to where you have a vault, but then your business is making money. Okay. Now what are you going to do with that? You can invest in the stock market. You can go start another business. It doesn't matter, but it's not about accumulating it.
And I think that is such sage advice in the sense of knowing that you're covered. Like, what a stress reducer for people thinking today, looking at their bank account going, what does my runway look at? I always look at when somebody's getting the mortgage business, my first question I ask them, what's your economic runway? When does the runway run out and this plane's going to crash and burn? Can you go 3 months without income, 6 months without income as you start building your book of business? What can you do? When do you need that first pay before everything collapses?
Yeah.
And I think that's important for somebody who's looking at starting a business to say, even if your runway is a month and you got that urgency and you just got to know it, just write it down and say, this is it. Because when that comes up, it's not a surprise.
Well, yeah. And I think it's for people starting a business, I think it's a good exercise because what I see is a lot of people throwing more money into bad businesses. And it's like, you got to set a timeline to say, this isn't working and cut your losses. Because most entrepreneurs have that disposition like I did of like, well, no, we can do it and we're going to keep pushing. And yeah, I did, I borrowed at 27 all the money that I had to start the business. And so I had zero runway. I had no income, nothing. I was stupid, frankly. I had 2 young children, but it worked. It worked out. But, you do need to, I think, put in some guardrails. If I had gone back and done it, I'd say, okay, well, if this isn't working after 2 months, I don't have any clients, I'm not bringing home a paycheck, we're cutting our losses.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Now, if there's one last thing you could leave with the audience that we haven't talked about, one thing that they could make a change instantly after listening to this podcast, what would that be?
I think at almost 55 years, I think the advice I would give is that know yourself. There's never going to be a point in your entrepreneurial journey that you don't have fear. And if you're always trying to suppress that fear or deal with that fear, and not just accepting that it's there, you're gonna run into a lot of self-destruction. So accept the fear, be brave, and do the right thing anyway.
And fear is always an indicator we're doing something that's going to make us grow.
Yes, it's uncomfortable. It's an unknown, and that's not necessarily a bad place to be.
No, it definitely. And to me, I mean, look, when I first did my first podcast, I was petrified that somebody was actually going to watch it. And now we're up to 23,000 subscribers. We get, 150,000 views a month. It's a whole different experience. And it all started with addressing fear. And so if there's anything you could do, according to Christian, is get into that moment of understanding that and moving. Christian, it's been an absolute pleasure, man. We had a long conversation to set up this podcast. I enjoyed it. And the podcast here, we've really covered some really good, I think, key components for people to focus on.
Well, thank you for having me, Steve. I appreciate it.
And guys, this is the money. This is the mindset. This is the mentoring podcast. We'll see you on the next one.